Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff McKay. I will be your host for this webinar, talking about 5 steps to keep your practice privacy breach free in 2020. We'll be going through some breaches that have happened. We'll look at some examples of what you can be doing and why to protect your practice. And you will come away with 5 tangible steps that you can implement in your practice to help keep privacy breaches out. As we get started, I'm just going to do a couple of housekeeping items. If you have any questions throughout, there is a question window in your GoToMeeting tab or GoToWebinar tab. You can type questions in there and we will address them. If you have anything sort of general, you can type it in the chat too. And we will do our best to answer all questions. If we can't get to them for time, we'll sort of do that after the fact with some emails. So let's get started. Our presenters today are experts in the field. Rohit Joshi, co-founder and CEO of BrightSquid, who has a few decades of experience in privacy compliance. He's a lawyer who does a lot of work and a lot of speaking around North America on these subjects. Ingrid Rise, who has been working in privacy compliance with clinics and healthcare organizations and regulators for at least a couple years. Several decades, 3 decades, maybe we'll say, okay. So let's look at the agenda for today. We're going to talk about just the fact that patients prefer clinics are compliant, look at some stats around there and why, how breaches are caused, look at the types of breaches that are impacting clinics, then we'll go through the 5 steps, and you can see what they are there, but we'll obviously get into more details, and then we'll have a little draw at the end for some winners. But first, patients prefer clinics that are compliant. And, you know, I think we deal with a misconception a lot of times that patients believe that or are okay with their information being exposed or put at risk for the sake of convenience sometimes, or they're not really concerned about it because there's no real threat. But the fact of the matter is, especially now, with a lot of the news around privacy compliance, privacy breaches, all of the things that are happening, Facebook is a great example. You know, more and more there's large breaches in Canada. Late last year, we saw a breach of about half the population of Canada, with about 15 million people being affected, I believe. There was a breach earlier this month that saw the breach of 400,000 patient records with great detail, including credit card and all kinds of treatment information that was accessed improperly. So patients are more and more aware. They are aware of the risks as well. And we know that 85% of patients' privacy is very important. So on a scale of 1 to 5, 85% are saying it's a 5 in terms of importance. Patients aren't comfortable sharing information over regular email. So a lot of clinics kind of get around that for the convenience and say, you signed a waiver saying that I can email you my stuff. And now as patients are more educated around the risks of email, the fact that 1 in 4 email accounts are hacked. When we asked patients if, you know, what they knew about that, 50% of patients admitted that they know that 1 in 4 emails are hacked. So even just looking to use that methodology with patients kind of drops your credibility a little bit, because patients are aware that you shouldn't be doing that, and they know that you shouldn't. So they also want to be included in communication. So they're looking for ways to be more engaged with patients. How are breaches caused? So over half of them are uninformed employees. So it's a training issue. It's making people aware of what they need to be doing to be compliant and protect the information. Ineffective antivirus. Even if you look at spam filters, for example, 16 million spam emails get through spam filters a day, and 8 million of them are clicked. So you need to be aware, and a lot of that comes back to training. You can't just rely on software to keep you safe. And along those lines, a quarter of breaches come through outdated or unpatched software. And a great example of that, Windows 7, which is no longer receiving security updates. So if you're using Windows 7, your clinic is at risk. And just some misconceptions around how breaches come in. It's not just clicking on bad links on your internet browser. If you look at how it comes in mobilely, most of it's coming in through apps. So it's getting in through backdoors that people have found in vulnerabilities. Now I'll bring Ingrid and Rohit in to talk about this. The types of breaches that we see, you know, most of them are unauthorized access. So employee snooping, social engineering, people getting access they shouldn't. Theft, so laptops getting stolen out of somebody's car or broken into the clinic and stealing a computer. And then loss and accidental disclosure, so sending a fax to the wrong person or mailing a letter or handing over the wrong file. So Ingrid, you were going to talk a little bit about the unauthorized access piece and how that...
Right. So the unauthorized access, as you can see, it's the largest chunk of the pie. And the reason is because employees tend to be curious, whether it's on their own information, their relatives, or just curiosity in general on whether it be an accident or somebody that they know. So that is a huge, huge breach, obviously, and it's a big risk. A big counteraction to that risk would be to, of course, have training. So that's why training comes back in. But again, it also ties to theft and loss, which Rohit will speak on.
You know, if we go around this pie, accidental disclosure is something that we see quite a bit of, and unfortunately, it's usually just a training issue. The accidental disclosure occurs because in many cases, information is given to people who weren't authorized to receive it. And so usually some training can help there. The other elements like loss and theft, there's a couple of examples that are important in the Canadian context, also important in the U.S. context. And I think the one that comes to mind, I think, from a theft perspective is sort of a made in Alberta loss, theft, which was a laptop stolen out of someone's vehicle. And I think the important lesson to be learned there is that, in fact, the custodian or the clinic is responsible for all of the contractors that work within that clinic and that deal with patient information. And so it's important to ensure that the clinic procedures and processes are followed, because ultimately, when you're working with other organizations, when you're working with your own employees, and that information is not tied down, any theft or loss comes back to that clinic. I think from a loss perspective, you know, there's, I think, so many examples that we've seen in Canada and the US where a thumb drive has gone missing, or a laptop stolen, or you know, some paper that's gone missing or shipped off to the wrong person. And all of those end up being breaches of some measure.
And I think we'll dig into this a little bit deeper. I think it's important to highlight the fact that you can't assume that just because it's common sense that it's okay. You know, why would you leave a laptop in your car that's unlocked in a late, dark grocery store parking lot, for example? You know, if the policies and procedures around the how you're going to carry those laptops around are not in place and not trained across your organization, that's still, the responsibility still sits with the custodian.
Yeah, and I would say that we've seen that regularly, Ingrid and I and all of us here, where they have a good set of policies and procedures. Someone has taken the time to build that. But then if it's not lived within that clinic and within the clinic and the vendors that the clinic uses, they're no good. And that's really where the challenge, and frankly what the privacy commissioners are now focusing on, is how good is the education program.
Right. So let's look at the steps and what you can do to keep breaches out. Step one is really the biggest step in terms of effort, gap identification and remediation. So that's doing an assessment and making sure that you understand where the risks are and what to do. So how does this play out in the clinic?
So, you know, typically what we've worked with clinics, we do a risk assessment, trying to understand what the gaps are based on best practices. So we have a number of clinics that we work with, and there is typically a distance between what the regulations look for, best practices, and where the clinics are now. So that's where we start our discussions, is how big is that gap? So understanding that in three different dimensions, right? We're looking at physical safeguards, administrative safeguards, and technical safeguards, all to understand better what's happening at that clinic. And I think, Jeff, I think we've got a risk assessment that's available on our website that will help people go through at least a cursory level of, do I have risk?
Yep.
And can we send that out? Is that part of?
Yeah, we will. Or I mean, it's available on brightsquid.com, but we will send it out after.
Because I think that's the best place to start. Is let's at least understand the size of the challenge inside of your clinic.
Yeah. And it's just a couple quick questions. We'll give you a score, we'll review it with you and make sure that you know how we can raise that score up to make sure you're scoring high in terms of privacy breach prevention.
Great.
Right, and all these gaps that we've identified and how to remedy them, the physical, administrative, and technical are not standalone. So you might have your physical safeguards very nice and tight. You're locked up. Everything is all secure. But then you have same password for everybody in the clinic. So you haven't met your administrative safeguards. So no matter how good you're locked up, if you let in every employee without any understanding or training, you are still at risk. So it identifies all physical, administrative, and technical.
Yeah. So step 2, I mean, we've said the word training, I think at least 25 times so far in the last 10 minutes.
But who's counting?
But who's counting? So this is really a big one. So how does this work?
So I think, as I mentioned before, when we're looking at the decisions that are coming out of the Privacy Commissioner after a breach, I think what's become more and more emphasized is the need for training and understanding. I think in many clinics now there may be a good set of policies, but if the clinic individuals, if the vendors don't know them, if the actual employees and contractors don't know them, then they're as good as not having them. And so what we've found is the training of all of the individuals in that clinic become really critical. Because ultimately, I think those of us that are probably on this webinar, we have to start understanding what a culture of privacy feels like inside of that clinic. And one of the things that we've done when we've done training, we invite the whole clinic, because I think as we're starting to change the culture of privacy, we almost want everybody in that clinic to be up to speed so they understand the importance of it. Because, it's part of the weakest link discussion. If you have a very good privacy officer and custodian, but nobody else in the clinic really understands or follows those processes, it's of no value. And so training, when we look at it, we look at, what are the typical cyber threats? So it's not just the regulations, it's actually looking at what's happening in the market, what's happening in the technical industry that allows for threats to become very real for clinics. The second is trying to look at very much of a practical scenario about how do regulations apply to day-to-day activities. And so I think one of the more effective things that we've tried to work with is come up with checklists that reflect the processes and procedures in your clinic. And how do you apply those on a weekly, monthly, annual basis to make sure that you're doing the things inside your practice that show that rigor? It's not just about, again, just putting procedures on the shelf. It's actually showing that rigor and living that rigor. And that's one of the things when we look at when we look at clinics, we try to understand what's their commitment to regular training. Is it an annual thing? Is it a lunchtime annual workshop? Is it coming to webinars like this? All of those apply, because again, it's trying to create sensitivity and a culture of privacy within that clinic. I would say one of the things that has been the most valuable in the training that we have done is the use of scenarios. So trying to understand how does a scenario that usually come from people in the audience or from our personal experience, how do we use those scenarios as training moments so that we don't repeat those challenges?
And I think that's a huge one, especially because all of the regulations across North America that we deal with, there are no scenarios. Not in this case you will do this. It's here's the way you have to do stuff, and applying it to your day-to-day can be tough sometimes.
So it makes a good segue into an example of a breach that had occurred. So a clinic employee that was on leave at a clinic actually entered the clinic during office hours and accessed EMR records using another employee's login credentials. So the staff member later informed the doc that this employee accessed the medical records of family and friends and removed copies from the files of the clinic. So where are the breaches, other than the fact there's numerous? One of the big things that came out of it is after the OIPC investigated, they found that the clinic actually did have policies and procedures in place, all good, but the problem was no one had been trained. So again, it comes back to the training of it, as well as the fact that people have to realize that includes post-termination. So if an employee is terminated, they have to understand that this information remains confidential for the rest of their life. They just can't say, okay, I quit at the clinic, now I can gossip about everything that I searched up. So training is critical to understand before, during, and after employment.
It's an interesting thing that you mentioned, Ingrid, around termination. One of the other big gaps that we've seen in clinics is when that person has left, they maybe didn't get their login shut off at the server. And in one case that I can think of immediately, the individual had access from home, and that login remained active. And they were able to access that clinic record after they left. And so there's, that sort of crosses administrative and technical controls, right? This is one of the things that you were saying, which is they're very, very coordinated in terms of how we try to approach those challenges at the clinic level.
Yeah, I think what's a great point in that regard is there's no such thing as almost compliant.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's black or white, right? It's you're compliant or you're not. So you can't say, well, I've done 75% of the job and that's good enough. So It doesn't work that way. So this is actually kind of a big one that we see when we survey clinics. We still see people tell us they're sending 100 to 150 or more emails containing patient information every month.
Yeah.
Hotmail.com or on, and it's a very critical thing because there's health information inside that email, and it's a huge risk.
Yeah, I think, it's a huge risk for so many reasons. So in the example, and this is, just the acronym here, this is from a news story where Alberta Health Services and one of their physicians lost 7,000 patients' personal health information through a hack. And what's interesting about this is against the rules of the clinic. This is against the rules of Alberta Health Services. Nevertheless, and I want to give the benefit of the doubt to the physician who wants to be in better contact with their patients, but in doing so, exposed 7,000 of them, and so it's not justified. The reality around what's happening with email is that the inbound email is the #1 ransomware vector, meaning that's the way ransomware spreads. It's very, very difficult. You have professional ransomware creators. That's all their day job is. And I can tell you that it is very difficult in some examples to detect it. But as soon as you click on that link, it now infects your computer, infects the network, and takes that information and makes it available to someone who's going to try to extort that clinic. So this is step number 3, because we see this as a massive hole inside of most clinics that we deal with. Texting is another hole that we see, but I think in many cases email is that place. Now, the after effect of this 7,000 patient data loss remains to be seen. This happened only in November of 2019. So we're still waiting for what's now going to happen in terms of a response. What are the fines? How much is this going to cost to fix? And what's the offer back to these patients? Typically, what we've seen in the U.S. is you can measure it by about $400 per patient. So we can do the math. 7,000 times 400 is what it would cost, what it's going to cost Alberta Health Services.
So step 4, we've talked about the safeguards at the beginning, but this really is the security and the technical safeguards.
Right. So from a technical perspective, like passwords, using strong passwords, I can't emphasize how important it is to have unique user logins. There's been numerous clinics that we've gone into that all have the same password because it's easier, or the computers are just left on so that, anybody coming in and out can just use them without having to sign on. It doesn't need to be unreasonable, but it's got to be logical. So when you leave a computer, you need to lock it. Numerous examples of breaches where somebody has gone in behind another person and actually accessed the information. Examples like if you have a password and it's too difficult, I've seen lots of places where we've walked into clinics with a sticky note with the password on the computer. So those are things to avoid. Use a strong password. Please don't post it on your computer. Should be obvious, but you'd be surprised. Update software, regular software updates. Again, the emphasis of this is, for example, Windows 7 is, they call it end of life. I say it's dead. Same difference in the end. But you need to continue to update that. So if you have 7, you're out of sync. So please keep your softwares up to date, and is your software still supported? That's an obvious. And then, of course, encryption. All your storage and your backups, please ensure they're encrypted.
And this is one of those things, you know, it's easy to talk about encryption. In fact, most modern computers have it built in. The cost is free. And but unless you're working with a capable IT team that understands this, you're not actually going to get it done. So make sure you, as a part of this, you're working with an IT team that understands the importance of security inside your clinic in a way that may not be common. You know, make sure that they've got healthcare experience.
Yeah. So step 5, pick your partners wisely, and this is an ongoing issue, as all of these are.
Right. So the reason I wanted specifically to speak to this slide, and I had to pull rank on this one, but what is starting to happen is, as a clinic, you may have done your PIA, you may have done your training, and you may be all compliant. But the truth is, the minute you send the information across to a clinic that's not, or a clinic that has no respect of privacy, hasn't done their PIA, doesn't understand it, hasn't done training, you have just opened up a weak link. And you're only as good. So you may be sending that information with the best intentions, the best security, and the best practices. But the minute you send it to another clinic who's not compliant, or worse yet, a vendor that refuses to sign an IMA or has no desire to get up to speed on privacy, you're going to find that we, again, you're sitting in a vulnerable position. So please make sure to limit your liability by making sure the agreements are in place. And of course, your PIA is up to date, as are your partners.
Yeah, and I think this is such an interesting one, because this is where, when we talk about a culture of privacy, it moves around, it moves through your vendors and through your business associates, right? Because, I mean, yes, we can figure out how to limit your liability. As a lawyer, we're very good at helping you make sure that you're not overexposed. But when that patient data gets lost, is it okay for you to say, well, you know, at least we're covered financially? Well, that is true, but does the patient really care? The patient's going to implicate you as far as your reputation goes. And we've seen examples of that, and unfortunately, in some very good cases where we've had very compliant clinics, there's still a reputational damage because the patient only knows that their information was wrongly sent or wrongly released. So this is a great example of that exact scenario, which is, you know, we had an example where we had one clinic that was doing a software upgrade, and as part of the software upgrade process, that software vendor took all of the patient files, backed them up, and then upgraded the software, and then was going to put the patient files back in. Now that all seems to make sense, and we liked how that was proceeding. Unfortunately, when it came time to restore all of that patient information, they took the wrong clinic's backup and put it into the wrong clinic's upgrade. And the way that clinic was set up is when it saw a new patient come up, that would automatically send welcome emails. So all of a sudden, there was 2,500 patients who received welcome emails from a clinic that they knew nothing about. And the response from the patients was very, very severe. And so we got engaged because one of those clinics actually was working with us. Now, again, because they were working with us, we had the liability stuff figured out, but there was still a reputational challenge. And that's something that, you know, they worked through. But it's a big one. It really requires everyone paying that kind of attention.
Any other comments on that, Ingrid?
No, but I couldn't agree more. I mean, you can imagine these patients. I mean, they were very upset. They feel that nobody was protecting their information when it was, and they were vulnerable. And they were angry at the clinic that contacted them saying, how did you get our information? What right do you have? It was a very aggressive bunch of calls that we received around this in our efforts to help the clinics.
So those are the 5 steps?
Those are the 5 steps, yeah. So you have until Friday to get them implemented in your but I mean, it's stuff that takes time and it is ongoing. And I think, what we see from the past, people have kind of implemented or written their policies and procedures, put them on a shelf. You go back to that example of the clinic that, a staff member on leave walked in and walked out with records they never should have had access to in the first place. As Rohit said, that clinic had policies and procedures sitting on a shelf. In the investigation, nobody could find them.
Yeah.
There was a record of it being submitted and accepted by the privacy commissioner, but there was nothing. Nobody knew where they were. Nobody had signed off on understanding what they were.
Nobody had been trained. Nobody, in the years that, for the longest employees who've been there for years, there was no record of training. There was no record of the kind of this privacy culture. And let's not make it a bigger deal than it needs to be. I think having people show up for webinars like this is part of it, right? It's an awareness issue, if nothing else.
I think your point about the culture, it's a culture of privacy that really drives it home. So we do have a couple questions. Before we do that, we'll just wrap up the final slide so we get this done. But the winner of most secure messages sent we have is David L. So congratulations, we'll be sending you a gift card. Number 2 is Dana B. So congratulations on that, and our third winner for being on the call is Chelsea M. So congratulations. The questions we have, the first one is, in regards to email, as long as we don't download anything, is it safe?
No. In fact, what the ransomware people have done very good at, I think one of the ones that spread the quickest was you're getting a refund. And it looked like it was coming from Amazon. They said that they had double billed someone, and all they had to do was click on this link and update their address so that they could get the refund. As soon as you clicked, it was downloading in the background ransomware that locked up that clinic.
Yeah, and the other great example is, social engineering. These people, it's their job to figure out how to get people to click on emails. And there's one great example, I think we used to have in one of our training presentations, that said, it was an email that said, hey, I found this line item from you on my credit card. I don't know why it's there. Here's the file. Take a look at it and let me know what I should do before I contact the police.
Yeah.
Right? So someone at the front desk gets that email. They're going to click on that file.
Totally.
Right?
And one of the things, Jeff, maybe in future, one of the things we might want to do, we've got a full hour of training in here's examples of ransomware, and that might help clarify this, because it's example after example of things that, frankly, look pretty real, and they're enticing. They look innocent, they look enticing. Who's not going to click to update their address to get some money?
Yep.
That speaks to everything that's important to me.
And it's just a coincidence that we're Amazon.com.
Yeah. So the next question we have, do you recommend having the latest operating system running on your work computers?
Absolutely.
100%. Yeah, I think, and if you supplement that with automatic updates, or if you have an IT team that's rigorous and diligent around that, the thing that we're starting to see more of is sort of same-day exploits, which is somebody finds it, they've created ransomware, and by noon on the same day, it's being exploited around the country. So automatic updates are the way to go, but if you've got an IT team that's got things locked down, make sure that they are rigorous, weekly looking at that.
Yeah, and the reason behind it is that all these updates and patches actually are catching all these ransomware, so they're updating regularly. Correct. If you're out of date, again, that comes back to that weakest link. They have that vulnerability. You're not updating and patching, you're going to be vulnerable.
One last question we'll do. Do you recommend cyber insurance?
We do recommend cyber insurance. In fact, we've worked with a company in the past and still do, because after all is said and done, most of your business continuity insurance that you probably already have for your practice doesn't cover cyber liability, or covers a maximum of, small amount of that, like $50,000. In the types of numbers that we've seen, we would recommend $250,000 or more, depending on the size of claim, because the ransomware itself is going to be between $5,000 and $50,000. That's what we've seen
Traditionally.
locally.
Yeah.
And there's a recent article that those are going up because they're getting
like 85. The average is 85,000.
The average. That's the article I saw.
It was like 4 times higher than it was a year ago.
Yeah. So get the ransomware insurance to make sure it's a minimum of $250,000.
Well, that brings us to time. Thank you so much for tuning in. We will send out the recording so you can check back, reference it later, share with other people in your clinic that you think might find it interesting, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. And if you have any questions, call or email.